Singaporeans currently employ around 250,000 foreign domestic workers. This means that nearly 1 in 5 households has a domestic worker who helps with groceries and cooking, cleaning, looking after children and the elderly, and general household chores. But their payment is not limited to the salary of a Singaporean domestic helper. The salary of a Singaporean domestic worker depends on the country of origin of the employee. For example, if the domestic helper is from the Philippines, you can expect to pay a minimum wage of $570. However, if the domestic worker is from Myanmar, you would expect to pay around $450, and a Sri Lankan FDW will charge $500. Indonesia can charge up to $550. You will be able to negotiate appropriately if your FDW has less experience. In addition to the Philippines and Myanmar, Singaporeans can hire foreign domestic workers from Cambodia, Bangladesh, India, Hong Kong, Macau, Malaysia, Thailand, Taiwan, and South Korea. According to MOM rules, an FDW must be 23 to 50 years old at the time of application. In addition, people over 50 can only renew their work permit until the age of 60. Overseas Filipino worker OFW is a term often used to refer to Filipino migrant workers, people with Filipino citizenship who reside in another country for a limited period of employment. The number of these workers was roughly 1.77 million between April and September 2020. Of these, female workers comprised a larger portion, making up 59.6%, or 1.06 million. However, this number declined to 405.62 thousand between 2019 and 2020. The term overseas Filipino worker was used as early as the 1990s to refer to Filipino migrant workers, when Republic Act 8042, also known as the Migrant Workers and Overseas Filipinos Act of 1995 was enacted. The term was officially adopted by the Philippine government when the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration adopted the 2002 PIA rules and regulations governing the recruitment and employment of land-based overseas workers. Historically, particularly during the administration of President Ferdinand Marcos, the term overseas contract worker was used. For statistical and probability purposes, the term overseas contract worker refers to OFWs with an active employment contract, while OFWs who are not OCs are migrant workers currently without a contract who had one within a given period of time. Flor Ramos Contemplacion was a Filipino domestic worker in Singapore. Flor Ramos Contemplacion suffers from poverty and decides to work as a domestic helper in Singapore thinking it will solve her problems. Unlike many other servants, she is well treated by her employers. However, in 1995, she was arrested and was charged of killing her fellow Filipina, Delia Maga, and the little boy she was caring for. On May 4, 1991, Delia Maga, a 34-year-old Filipino domestic worker, was found strangled to death in Singapore. A 3-year-old boy, Nicholas Huang, whom Maga had been taking care of, was discovered drowned. Although Huang's father could not identify a suspect, the police learned about Contemplacion through Maga's diary. The police interrogated Contemplacion, who initially confessed to the crimes of murdering Maga and Huang. Contemplacion never retracted her confession, and the Philippine Embassy in Singapore deemed her confession credible. Flor Contemplacion, a 42-year-old Filipina maid, was convicted by a Singaporean court of killing another Filipina maid, Delia Maga, and Nicholas Huang, the 3-year-old Singaporean son of her employer, on May 4, 1991. She had originally confessed to the murders. It was, however, later claimed that she made the confession under duress, and it has also been claimed that she was of doubtful sanity at the time they were committed, although this seems unlikely. At least 2 maids came forward during the week prior to the hanging to suggest that the little boy drowned during an epileptic fit in a bathtub and his father killed Mrs. Magla and framed Flor in a fit of rage. 1. Virginie Paramog said in an affidavit she had shared a cell with Flor and had evidence of her innocence. In her affidavit, Paramog said Flor told her that Della immediately phoned her employer about the incident. Her male employer immediately rushed home. Very angry, the employer strangled Della's neck. Then the employer called the police and implicated Flor in the double murder. On January 29, 1993, Flor Contemplacion was sentenced to death by hanging. The Philippine government had requested a stay of execution. Solicitor General Raul Goco, in a letter to the Singapore government, asked for this to put all doubts to rest before the case of Mrs. Contemplacion comes to a final conclusion. He had urged Singapore to defer the hanging on humanitarian considerations. Philippine President Fidel Ramos had personally asked Singapore to postpone the execution until new evidence, testimony from another Filipino maid had been evaluated. But the Singapore government said it carefully investigated this new evidence and found it to be untrue. Therefore, the Singaporean president, Ong Teng Cheong, found there was no basis to justify a stay of execution. Flor Contemplacion was hanged by Darshan Singh at 6 in the morning on Friday the 17th of March 1995 together with 3 male drug traffickers, amidst scenes of unusually tight security. 8 policemen, including 2 armed with machine guns and wearing flak jackets, stood outside the prison gates with 2 dogs. Police cars and motorcycles patrolled the street continuously, apparently to deter protests by the estimated 75,000 Filipinos working in Singapore. She was informed of the date and the time of the hanging on Tuesday the 14th of March 1995 before the execution, as is customary in Singapore, and apparently took the news calmly. She was resigned to her fate, and she tried to be strong and told the children to be strong and love one another. Contemplacion was hanged at dawn on March 17, 1995. At the Changi Women's Prison and Drug Rehabilitation Center despite a personal plea for clemency to the Singaporean government from Philippine President Fidel Ramos. The execution caused a major diplomatic row between Singapore and the Philippines, after Singapore rejected an appeal from the Philippines President, Fidel Ramos. There were protests outside the Singapore embassy in Manila. Flor Contemplacion's body was released and flown back to Manila and was greeted by the president's wife, Amelita, at the airport. Perhaps, extraordinarily for a country that was actively trying to restore the death penalty itself at the time, President Ramos and the Philippine people saw Contemplacion as a heroine. Some mourners waved white handkerchiefs and others clenched their fists and carried placards saying "Justice for Flor Contemplacion" as her funeral cortege passed through Manila's streets. Thousands jammed into the small town of San Pablo, where she had lived, to pay their last respects to Flor. More than 5,000 town residents and supporters from Manila and nearby areas flocked round her one-room house to try to catch a glimpse of her body in its open white coffin. Roman Catholic Bishop Teodoro Bacani held a requiem mass in the town's crowded cathedral for her. He told the congregation, "She is a symbol of millions of Filipinos driven by poverty to take their chances abroad." Anger swept the Philippines as the news of the execution broke. Leftist and feminist groups, human rights activists and the media denounced Singapore as a barbaric, tyrannical and totalitarian state with no respect for human rights. The Roman Catholic Church called Singapore a state without mercy. Flor had said, on the eve of her execution, that she was ready to die after final pleas for clemency and a new trial had been rejected. The Philippine Foreign Secretary said that she had thanked Filipinos for their efforts in trying to save her, but had said that if the stay of execution will only delay the carrying out of her sentence, she preferred to have an early end to everyone's suffering instead. Flor was visited in Changi prison daily by her children, a 21-year-old son, a 17-year-old daughter, and 15-year-old twin boys who had last seen their mother in 1989. But her husband Efrain didn't visit her because, "I could not bear to see her and not be able to touch her or embrace her after 7 years." He had made an emotional appeal a week earlier for help in saving his wife. Many Filipinos believed that Contemplacion was innocent or at least insane, blaming the Singaporean government for a lack of compassion, and the Philippine government for not doing enough to stop the execution. The Philippine embassy in Singapore in particular was criticized since it did not even have a consular representative as an observer in court throughout the trial. The Philippine Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Roberto Romulo, and Secretary of Labor and Employment, Nieves Confisor, both resigned as a result of the controversy. Flor Ramos Contemplacion was 42 years at the time of her execution. Thank you for watching Death Row.